Alix. Welcome back.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for having me again. We have to stop meeting like this.
I know. I'm so grateful for your time yet again. We had you on last week where we were talking about vaccines in the workplace. Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit more sensitive, which is mental health and disclosing mental illness in the workplace. Thank you again for your time. I'm grateful for this conversation. I know a lot of people can relate to this as they think about the new year and potentially returning back to their offices post-COVID. So this is going to be a really important conversation, and I'm hoping we help employees and employers alike with this chat. So just a little bit about the series, Michelle's Conversations That Matter. I'm really out to elevate the conversation about mental health in general, really have experts on to share their wisdom with us, educate us. People like yourself, people like clinicians who can educate us on different diagnoses, and even individuals who want to share their story. What I get to do professionally is I work with organizations to recenter their people and build psychological resilience and compassion in the workplace. So without further ado, for people who maybe missed your interview last week when we were talking about the vaccines, could you just take a second, Alix, just reintroduce yourself, who you are, what you do, where you live?
Sure. So I'm Alix Rubin, owner of Rubin Employment Law. We've been in business now for 11 and a half years. Hard to believe. I've been a lawyer for 25 plus years, and I focus my practice exclusively on employment law, helping employers and employees to stop fighting so everyone can get back to business. That's what we always strive to do. If I have to go to court, I do, but I try to avoid court situations. So there you go. I live in West Caldwell, and my office is in Fairfield, both in New Jersey.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So this is a topic that has sort of been a lot of people that I know in my sphere have been talking about it now, with employers trying to reopen their doors, trying to get people back into the workplace in some fashion. Of course, there's all these challenges with the variant and everything, but I know a lot of companies were trying to open their doors in the new year. But as we know, a lot of people over the past year and a half with this pandemic have been experiencing a whole host of emotions, and many who maybe have never experienced a mental health challenge now have one, and they are trying to figure out, what does return to work look like for me? So I guess let's just start off by talking about, in general, when an employee does disclose, what does it mean? So if you're an employee and you're being asked to come back to work, you have a mental illness now, you've never told anyone about it, what's that? What should they be thinking about when it comes to disclosing?
So I think it, at that point in time, as an employee, you probably need to disclose you don't need to disclose your specific diagnosis, but the fact that you have an illness that is preventing you from returning to the office. And obviously you're going to be asked for documentation, and you will need to provide that. And, that would be a note from your doctor, and that would contain more information about the illness. Again, it doesn't always have to list this specific diagnosis, but the reasons why, this employee cannot come back to work yet, is under my care, cannot come back to the office yet, and anticipate when, they would be able to come back to the office, those kinds of things. But again, that doesn't necessarily, that shouldn't be disclosed to your supervisor. It should be disclosed to whoever's in charge of approving, remote work and or some type of medical leave. And that's typically HR, if there is a human resources, department in your company.
So that's so the question comes up a lot, like, at what point do I disclose? Is it only if I feel like I need an accommodation or I am struggling? I think a lot of us now, new employment forms now actually have a box you can check if you have a mental health challenge, right? So I think a lot of employees are like, well, if I have it under control, if I'm managing it and I'm doing okay, I don't want to disclose. when is the right time to disclose? Is it only when they need an accommodation?
I would say so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, unfortunately, our societies, there's still a stigma around mental illness. And, maybe some mental illnesses, there's less of a stigma than others. Like people are more accustomed to hearing about depression, for example. But bipolar disorder, even though one component of that is depression, is still often an issue for people. It's a personal preference, obviously, but I have recommended to people, don't disclose it unless you need to. And if you do disclose it, it's on a need to know basis. So, if you're not disclosing it to your supervisor or HR, don't tell your coworkers, necessarily, unless one of your coworkers happens to be your best friend and, swears up and down, they'll keep it confidential. But otherwise, that is confidential medical information that needs to only be disclosed to those with a need to know. And, look, as the person with that, who owns that information, so to speak, it's your personal medical information, personal health information. You can choose to disclose it if you want to, but I recommend against it unless you need it to help you, with your work and help you get the proper accommodation.
So when it is disclosed, there are protocols, right? Like you said, that I guess another fear an employee might have to disclose is like, well, everyone's going to find out about this. It's going to go in my file. My supervisor is going to find out about it. But you say there are specific protocols, like you mentioned, that should protect that information.
Absolutely. It's confidential medical information, just like any other medical information that might be disclosed about you. We talked last week about, whether you're vaccinated or not, that kind of information. Or, if you get hurt at work, even information related to that, to a workers' compensation claim. Anything like that has to go in a separate file, separate from your personnel file, separate file that, again, is kept under lock and key only. And only certain people who have a need to know have access to that file. Again, your supervisor doesn't need to know why you need to work from home or why you're on medical leave. They just need to know the fact that you need to work from home and you're on medical leave and it's been approved.
What rights do employees have when it comes to these types of invisible disabilities?
Yes, and I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking about that before we started, about what's so difficult about mental illness in the workplace is that it is invisible, unless, of course, the person's acting out in some way. But otherwise, it is, it's not like accommodating someone in a wheelchair or accommodating someone with a cane or, some other type, or even someone who has a hearing disability or a visual or a speech disability. It's invisible for the most part. So which also means that it's some people don't believe you when you tell them you have this problem.
Right.
And that's where the documentation comes in.
Right.
So I'm sorry, and I forgot what your exact question was. I was talking.
What are the rights? What are the rights of employees
Yes.
who do have an invisible disability?
Yes. So yes, going into accommodation. So like I mentioned before, medical leave could be a reasonable accommodation. Remote work could be a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable means it doesn't cause an undue hardship to the company. And there are a lot of factors that get weighed into that. But, again, the company is also obligated to have what's called an interactive dialogue with you about what do you need and what can we provide and what makes sense. And just because you ask for something doesn't mean you'll get it, but maybe there's some alternatives that the company can provide. And they're required to do that, to try to figure this out so that you can keep your job. Now, indefinite leave has been found by the courts not to be a reasonable accommodation. Obviously, you can't hold on to a job indefinitely and not work and be out on leave indefinitely. But, and remote work may not be the answer for some types of jobs, even though temporarily some companies were able to have all their employees work remotely because of the pandemic. But now that's not the case. And they want people back, and that's their prerogative. Again, if they can accommodate you for short period of time, that's one thing, but indefinitely may not be the case. Again, it depends on the job and the company and the culture.
Right, right. It's interesting. I have heard from people who say, now job applications actually have a voluntary box that you could check off if you have a mental health condition or mental illness.
Mm.
And it's sort of a weird thing, right? Like if somebody's got it under control and they're managing it and they're under care and they're fine, why? What's the advantage of checking that box? It's a very interesting thing. I have a friend who is asked me to ask you a question related to that. She's never checked that box that she has PTSD and she's been fine. But now she finds herself in a very stressful work situation where that situation is triggering her PTSD
Mm.
and could benefit from an accommodation. What advice do you have around something like that?
So, first off, I think it's problematic for companies to have that as a question on an application in the first place. It's actually against, well, it being voluntary maybe puts it in a different category, but that you could choose not to answer
Mhm,
either way, right? As long as you don't have to check yes or no, right? If you
mhm.
just leave it blank, that's okay. I still think it's problematic as an employer. I would never do that.
Right.
I would never advise any of my clients to do that. Maybe some companies have this culture, a compassionate culture where they want to help and they want to know. But again, it's against the Americans with Disabilities Act and the New Jersey law against discrimination and the New York human rights law to ask that question on an application. Now, if it's a safety sensitive job, after the offer is made, that question could be asked and see if the employee, soon to be employee, needs an accommodation. If that's something the company can do, it would be a conditional offer based on passing. Some jobs require medical examinations, but that's not until the offer's made.
Right.
That's not on the application. So it's the same thing. You can't ask medical questions. Employers are not permitted to ask medical questions on an application, period. So I think that really crosses the line there. So I understand your friend's concern that she didn't check that box, which doesn't really mean anything. She didn't say no. I mean, it would be different if she said no and it turns out she did have the illness. So then she lied on the application. That could be reason for termination. But again, I think that's an illegal question to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But not checking the box either way, not answering that question, and now she needs an accommodation and I'm assuming it's a she,
Yeah.
he or she,
Yeah.
and now needs to disclose it. Well, that's fine. I mean,
Right.
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So then that has us switching gears, right? When it comes to HR leaders, a lot of my people in my community and my network are in the HR space. So let's talk about what advice you have for HR leaders in terms of handling these situations and these scenarios. What advice do you have for HR leaders?
So number one, be compassionate, be considerate, be circumspect, right? Keep, this information confidential. That's your obligation as an HR person. HR people know more about employees than anybody else, most likely. And, you keep it to yourself, right? Only tell those who have a need to know. And try to limit what you tell, for example, the supervisor or the manager. Limit what you tell them. No, this person, we've approved, remote work, we've approved leave, whatever the accommodation may be.
Mhm.
And we have valid reasons for it. And we're not, oh, why? What's wrong? What's this? What's that? And look, often the manager is just, again, is being compassionate, wants to know what's going on with their employee, but say, you know what? I'm not at liberty to discuss that. That's confidential medical information. And, if the employee chooses to disclose it, but you shouldn't ask them, right? I think that's the best advice, and just try to, make sure you're having these interactive dialogues with employees who may need something. Don't don't assume anything.
Mhm.
Often an employee might, it comes up when there's some type of disciplinary action either taken or being contemplated,
Yeah.
and then the employee discloses, well, that's because I have this illness, right?
Right.
And like, well, okay, but be compassionate, but also be, look, you still need to be able to do the job
Mhm.
with or without a reasonable accommodation. So
Mhm.
is there something we can do to help you do the job better? Given your illness, we'll let this one slide because we didn't know. And now that we know, don't
Yeah.
be, don't retaliate against employees for sure.
Right. Yeah.
Don't put them in a bad situation. Try to accommodate. By the same token, look, the company, has to have employees who can work, has to be able to do business. So, take that into account as well.
Yeah, that's so important. Now, you work with clients all the time. Do you have any examples of a client that's gotten it right that you can say, like, they did the right thing in a specific situation? Obviously, keeping the client confidential, but is there anything
Sure.
to share in terms of best practices?
Yes. Now, recently, I was asked, to do a consultation with a client who unfortunately has an employee who has had cancer, and currently in a pretty advanced stage. Apparently, she's had cancer since earlier this year, since around January of this year. She's been working remotely the whole time, even though most other employees are back in the office. She's been working remotely. They've allowed her to do that, even though part of her job really can only be done in the office. Other people are doing that piece of her job. She's been working remotely. So they've been accommodating her in that respect. It's gotten to a point, and the reason they came to me for advice is because it's gotten to a point where they really can't sustain that anymore. They're getting too busy. They
Mhm.
really need to hire somebody else to do, those functions that she can't do because she's working from home, and she is unfortunately getting weaker and weaker. So together we made the decision that we should really offer her medical leave at this point.
Mhm.
And what's the advantage? And we looked at all the options, and look, this employer got it right. They didn't want to hurt her. They wanted her to, they thought about cutting her hours, but then that would cut her pay. And we
Yeah.
did a financial calculation and realized she would actually do better not working at all and collecting New Jersey disability benefits instead. That would be better than cutting her hours in half or whatever fraction we were looking at. So that's what they've decided to do, and hopefully that she'll be okay with that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but
It's
I think that's a compassionate way to approach it. Do as much as you can to accommodate. It'll get to a point when you can't do that accommodation anymore. See if you can find something else,
right.
and that doesn't hurt the employee too much or the company.
It's interesting. We are not the same people that we were before this pandemic. We have experienced a lot over the past year and a half. And I just keep thinking about, like, to the organizations that said, no, you can't work remotely. And we were all forced to work remotely and make it work. Right. So the argument is there that why can't I continue to work indefinitely? Right. So you have, people who may have experienced massive loss, depression, through the isolation. I can't help but wonder the employees who just want to say to their companies, "It's great you're opening your doors, but, like, why can't I continue to work from home? If I could do it before, why can't I do it now?" Like, I
Right.
mean, I see that potentially being, um, a multifaceted scenario, right? People could do their job from home, and maybe now they have a mental health challenge that they've been able to navigate in the privacy of their own home. So, what are your thoughts around the resistance to go back into the office? Because a lot of companies want that cohesion and want people together again.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
So, look, it's a company's prerogative to want people back in the office as long as they can make it safe, or as safe as possible for everybody.
Mhm.
Now, with the vaccines, I think that's more realistic than it was before the vaccines. And that's why there is starting to be more of this return to the office. But it's a real fine line between I'm afraid, I don't want to go back, I just rather work from home,
Yeah.
to my doctor says I should work from home because
Right.
of my condition, whatever it might be. And again, the employee doesn't have to disclose the condition. That's up to the doctor to, and even the doctor doesn't have to get all that specific necessarily. Again, it depends. I guess it has to be a verifiable condition that, and again, mental illness is much harder than, I broke my leg and I need to,
Yeah.
be on bed rest or something, or something, or I need to be on bed rest for whatever reason.
Right.
And work, but I can work in my bed, but not in an office. It's different. So it is, there are a lot of fine lines there. And I think just accommodate when you can, but understand, maybe, well, come in a couple days a week instead of a full week. I mean, a lot of places are doing that anyway.
Yeah.
And people alternate so that there aren't too many people in the office at one time.
Right.
For that reason. So maybe it works. Yeah. Just come in 3 days a week or 2 days a week and, start that, do it gradually. But again, you want to be in consultation with the employee and their doctor as
Right.
what makes sense.
I think when I think about employees fearful of disclosing, fearful of being perceived as not a strong employee as their peer, right? All of this comes into play with, am I going to be looked over for a promotion? Am I going to be looked over that I can't handle, stress, right? That's a myth. I mean, I think a lot of us would say it's a myth, right? That just because you have a mental health diagnosis that you're not as resilient or you can't handle stress. So there's all of that, all of the fears that employees would have, I would think, about disclosing because they don't want to not be considered for those things that they've worked hard for.
Right.
So it's really, I guess, I'm circling back to what you said about the protection of that confidential sharing with HR and keeping that, hopefully protected, right?
Yeah. And you said hopefully is the key word. I mean, you can't prevent human nature from doing what it might do.
Right.
And from having, unconscious bias. We talk about unconscious bias in terms of, race and ethnicity and things like that and gender. Well, it occurs in terms of mental illness as well.
Yeah.
And you can't prevent that. That's there, that it exists. So do your best. If you're the employee with the mental health problem, do your best to keep it to yourself until you need to disclose it for, to get an accommodation. And look, just because you ask for an accommodation doesn't mean you'll get it either.
Right.
But if the reason is legitimate, but the company just, a smaller company may not be able to accommodate you, and that it is what it is. I did want to comment on one other thing you said, which I appreciate that you said that, sometimes there's a perception that someone with a mental illness is weaker or not as productive or not as, is going to get stressed out too easily. And that may be the case, but I have seen people with mental illness actually overcompensate.
Yeah.
And they're actually like some of the best performers.
Yeah.
And then they go home and they crash, and then they need a day off to just like recuperate, from that, because it took so much more for them to perform than for someone without their condition.
And one of the things, and I love that you mentioned unconscious bias, and when it comes to mental illness and mental health, one of the things that I teach in my leaders program is just that. Like, we all have our own biases around mental illness, and we may or may not even know it based on our upbringing, based on our interactions with someone with a mental illness, but that's from the lens that we lead. So it's real important to get present to what is your belief system around mental illness, and are you going to look at your employee, are you able to look at your employee with compassion, or do you have judgment around that, right? Like, I had a conversation with a gentleman who was like, I've never experienced a mental illness. I'm tougher than most. And I said, it's not really about toughness,
Right.
but like that was his perception, and that's where he would lead from. So I think that's so important to recognize that. And
yes, absolutely. Listen, I've been in situations where I've heard, family members of individuals with mental illness saying similar things like, well, you're just lazy, or, just, pardon the expression, but just suck it up, right? Or, right.
Yeah.
Get
And that,
over it.
yeah.
The illness, and I'm not a clinician. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I think there is no such thing necessarily as getting over it. You don't just get over a mental illness like that. There are triggers, there's treatment and there's therapy and there's ways to get through it eventually, but it's not like instantaneous.
Right. Exactly. And I think that leaders have the ability to create a more trusting rapport with their people and foster compassion, so that, I think about an employee who might be struggling with a mental illness and is terrified to disclose, and so is also struggling and trying to keep it a secret. Concealing the secret of a mental illness on top of the day-to-day stress of our jobs is just not fair and not sustainable and not realistic. So I think organizations can do a better job of creating more communication, trust, and compassion, so that employee doesn't have to feel like they have to keep that secret and carry that burden with them every day.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't seem fair, right? You wouldn't do that, to someone with a physical challenge.
True.
So,
but you have to look at the reality. But I think, and going back to, you were asking my advice about just should I or shouldn't I disclose, you got to make sure you understand the culture of the company you work for. And if you feel comfortable that it's an accepting culture, then by all means disclose it. If that's, but if you're not sure, or that there are people there who are going to have a bias, then don't, unless you have to.
Right. That's great advice. Know your culture is such a good point that we haven't touched on. And I think it's so important. You can't expect people to feel comfortable disclosing if the environment is not there for them to feel that way. Maybe that's not where they should consider employment. Maybe there's another place for them that they would feel more comfortable. So all of these things come into play. It's quite remarkable when you think about it. Do you have any other advice for HR leaders and leaders in general? Because I get from people the trepidation around overstepping, and do I say too much? Like, what advice do you have for leaders and HR folks around having these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You want to show compassion, be compassionate, be as accommodating as you can be, but on the other hand, don't pry. Don't ask too many questions. Only ask what you need to ask. If you suspect, if an employee has not come forward with a request for an accommodation or with a disclosure of a mental illness, don't assume and don't ask. Don't ask. You can ask, but don't ask, do you have, are you suffering from depression, or are you, or do you have a mental illness that's, ask, is there something going, is there anything we can do to help you do your job better? Right. I think that's a better question to ask, rather than trying to get to the root cause of it. It's not your job to get to the root cause.
Right. Excellent. Really good advice. Any other final words of wisdom that you would like to share with employers or employees that we have not covered?
I think we covered it all pretty much. Just, try to work together, try to work this out if you can. Like I said, some of your best workers may be suffering from mental illness and you don't even know it until you do. And then, it may be worth your while to accommodate them.
So, Alix, you support employees and employers alike, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Good. So if people have questions and they want to reach out to you, whether they're an employee with something around their mental illness, or an employer, maybe an HR or business partner would like to have a conversation with you, how's the best way for them to reach you?
Yes, they can connect with me through LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. Reach out to me through LinkedIn, and then we can, I won't give you my email address because you won't be writing it down anyway, or my phone number, but connect with me through LinkedIn, and then I can provide that, and you can call my office or email me, that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your generosity and sharing your wisdom multiple times on Michelle's Conversations That Matter. I'm so grateful for your time and for your support. I think it's great. You added a tremendous amount of value today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the opportunity.
We will stay in touch, I'm sure.
Yes.
All right. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.